Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's another Monday morning. Today, it's February 17th of 2025. And I hope you all are doing well. Thanks for joining me and thanks for being with me. Reminder, if you're watching me on YouTube, that it's great. It would be great if you would sign up to follow me on Rumble, as I keep having dreams of either YouTube. If YouTube doesn't straighten up pretty soon, I'm going to actually drop their channel. I've threatened it so many times, but anyway, welcome if you're on Rumble. Welcome if you're on Facebook. So many people find it's easier to follow me on Facebook, and so we have a McDuff Lives page there. A few hundred people have already signed up, and great to see you there. If you are really just want to watch all the archives and the shows after, because they're not live, you can watch my McDuff Uncensored channel on BitChute, and there you can find all of my shows. None of them have been censored there in the past 4 years. So, and thanks everybody for the support at Patreon. Last year we had a Patreon total of $3,000 over the year, and that really helps me when I buy all these books, because I assure you it comes in one hand and out the other. These two books I'm looking at today, for instance, one of them is fairly rare, The American Pope. I could only get it in an old paperback with brown pages, published in 1984. But wow, I've been studying it over the weekend. And also over the weekend, I have nearly finished reading An American Requiem by James Carroll. And that's where I wanted to start this morning, just to kind of tie the last show, number 271, with this one. We started talking about Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, also known as Hitler's Pope, in the famous book by John Cornwell, controversial, and actually was forced to withdraw a little bit of what he said in that book. Mr. Cornwell did, but nevertheless, it's a fascinating and important account, because what we're trying to do is to grasp the state of mind of people, and how could they do that? How could you do that? How could you, do genocide? How could you do melee? How could you drop napalm? How could you just do all of these crimes against humanity? How? Why? Well, that's a real big picture question, and it's probably something that I've been trying to get my arms around for many, many years. But one of the aspects of our present day that I haven't focused much on is the Catholicism aspect. And so I launched into that last week, and with a study of Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII. And that's where I'll start with my reading. This is from American Requiem by James Carroll, page 51. In the 1950s, Pope Pius XII set aside his earlier abhorrence of the deliberate mass targeting of civilians. Okay? During World War II, he had criticized the Allies for the bombing of cities like Hamburg and Dresden, and all of the horrible destruction of civilian life. But now he is okay with it. He powerfully reiterated the Catholic just war theory for the Cold War, and emphasizing its notion of the acceptability of, quote, unintended but predictable consequences, unquote. What that means is collateral damage. In I think was it Alexander Haig's phrase, but no, these are the unfortunate ones that have no voice, the common people, the innocent people, because they don't involve themselves in the cause of the war or who's fighting who, but they are just trying to make a family and feed their kids and get along in life. But now it's okay. And because of the Cold War, according to the Pope, who is, in his own opinion, the ultimate moral authority on earth due to his deep connection directly to God with that, that golden telephone that he has. No, wait a minute, that's IT&T. Sorry. Anyway, he has that direct connection. The Pontifex, the bridge to God, and so very authoritative, especially among those people who don't spend their lives studying politics and religion and the wars of the centuries. No, people who need to spend their day raising vegetables and tending to flocks and taking care of business, not studying the intricate philosophies that people in religious leadership have time and inclination and willingness to do. And then they impose that upon us that don't really do all that work and can't really argue with them. What's behind it? Well, what's behind the Cold War? We have talked about that many times. Let's get into the morality of it. The deaths of millions in a nuclear exchange were predictable, but according to this casuistry, unintended and therefore acceptable. Unintended and therefore acceptable. Now, James Carroll makes reference elsewhere in the book to the birth control controversy that was also very hot back in the 60s, where the church was against any kind of birth control whatsoever. And to affirm that, Pope Paul VI issued an encyclical called Humanae Vitae, or About Human Life. And the most glaring part of it is to James Carroll and to most Catholics who are in favor of at least condoms or some kind of a method to avoid pregnancy. He's, how can I say? Pope Paul VI is completely against it. It's the rhythm method or nothing, right? And yet, what I always point out when I refer to that encyclical is this, that there is another paragraph about vaccines. And guess what it says about vaccines? They say that you can't use vaccines unless that could interfere with fertility, unless it is, and I don't remember the exact word, but unless it is an unintended consequence. So here you have Paul VI using, Pius XII's imagery of unintended consequences, and you say, we really smart church people can engage in this thing called casuistry. Casuistry is like when you see things that are coincidences, but you decide that they're connected because it helps you to tell the big narrative of history or the church or politics. And so you just kind of allow yourself to put the two things together in a way that people will then believe is true. And a lot of history is written that way. Casuistry is the word. So here we now have a second instance in which, not only in nuclear war, but also in considering whether it's okay to have vaccines that have an unintended consequence of sterility. And then guess what happens? We have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people becoming sterile all over the world. How did that happen? Okay, well, you can tell that's a subject that I'm very passionate about, and I had to point that out. But let's get back to our friend Cardinal Francis Spellman. Of course, in Catholic formal rhetoric, you say Francis Cardinal Spellman, but most people would just say Cardinal Francis Spellman at this point, and that's my usage. Now I'm going to turn to the American Pope, The Life and Times of Francis Cardinal Spellman by John Cooney, reviewed in New York Times Book Review as gossipy and absorbing. And I'm going to read the prologue because it gives you great context of how powerful he was in the early 60s. New York was blustery on a Wednesday evening, October 19th, 1960. Okay, let's think about that. October 19th, 1960. Who's the president? Okay. It's still Eisenhower. When's the election? 3 weeks away. Okay. Leaves swirled on Park Avenue and the wind whipped the flags outside the Waldorf Astoria as hundreds of men and women in evening dress scurried in from the night chill and threaded through the noisy, smoky lobby. Their voices resonated as they greeted friends and acquaintances. Here were the rich, the powerful, and the famous, gathering for an extraordinary affair. The occasion was the 15th Alfred E. Smith Memorial Foundation dinner, always hosted by Francis Cardinal Spellman, the Archbishop of New York. The annual dinner had become perhaps the most significant political banquet in the nation. Senators, congressmen, and political bosses all vied for invitations. Ostensibly a fundraiser for a Catholic charity, the affair functioned as a glittering showcase for the Cardinal's ties with businessmen, politicians, and military leaders. The annual guest list showed who was in or out of favor with the powerful prelate. Most people whose names had been removed were troubled. Few willingly risked falling from grace with Spellman, the most influential religious leader outside the Vatican. As usual, the dinner was attended by wealthy Republicans and Pentagon officers whose conservative views reflected the Cardinals, but mocked the progressive politician after whom the dinner was named. Al Smith, of course, the first Catholic candidate for president. Among them were the incredibly rich, the press lord Henry Luce, the industrialist J. Peter Grace, and the financier Bernard Baruch, all sat at the head table within touching distance of Spellman. Now, those three names have been big in my McDuff's Lives series, and both Henry Luce and Peter Grace connected to the Knights of Malta, and Bernard Baruch, of course, well, he is connected to the financiers. The Cardinal had always had a high regard for military men, and generals and admirals in dress uniform were scattered among the 2,500 guests. They had known Spellman on the battlefields of Europe and Asia, or at the Pentagon, where the Cardinal was a familiar figure and even attended military intelligence briefings. That ought to tell you something. They included Army General Willis Crittenberger and Franklin, Major General Westmoreland. From the Navy, there were Rear Admirals John Bergen and Gordon McClintock, among others. Legions of politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, were everywhere. New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller stood at the center of a large pool of well-wishers, booming "Hiya" in all directions. New York City Mayor Robert F. Wagner automatically pressed the flesh of everyone who gravitated his way, while U.S. Attorney General Herbert Brownell buzzed in the background about problems facing the Eisenhower administration. The Democratic warhorse James Farley, whose phenomenal memory rivaled Spellman's, effortlessly recalled the first names of dozens of men and women whom he had met only fleetingly years before. Former governors W. Averill Harriman, Herbert H. Lehman, and Thomas E. Dewey held court, as did U.S. Senator Jake Javits, the Tammany Hall boss, Carmine DeSapio, and the Union leader, Harry Van Arsdale, Jr. The dazzling array of powerful men included some of the Cardinal's closest confidants, such as John Coleman, who wielded great influence on the New York Stock Exchange, and John S. Burke, the president of the B. Altman department store, both of whom were Catholics devoted to their church. Judges, ambassadors, and members of the rich Irish society, including the Murrays, the McDonalds, the Cudahy's, remember them, mingled with such guests as Louis Rosenstiel, the ruthless founder of the Schenley Liquor Company, and Roy M. Cohn, the former special counsel to Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, who had also been close to the Cardinal. How close, I wonder. But isn't it remarkable that all of these people will hang out with a Roy Cohn, knowing what he is, knowing who he is? The Cardinal himself edged slowly through the crowd, which parted reflexively whenever he moved. At age 71, his once brisk walk had been slowed to a shuffle by high blood pressure and heart problems, and he was aided at times by the knot of his own hand-picked monsignors and bishops who executed his commands, carried his word to politicians, and cultivated men and women of prominence. They were priests who had tied their fortunes to those of the Cardinal, and who basked in the aura of power that surrounded him. What was startling about Spellman was the sharp contrast between his physical appearance and the length of the shadow he cast over political and economic affairs. A bald, plump man, barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, he was swathed from head to toe in the scarlet robes of his office. A gold pectoral cross, a present from Pope Pius XII, dangled from his neck and sparkled in the light that showered from huge chandeliers. His round face was practically unlined, his canny intelligence visible in sharp eyes that took in everything at a glance. To many people, Spellman appeared to be a humble little priest who went about God's work in a simple way, with a prayer on his lips. Most of his flock knew little about him other than what they read in the newspapers about his moral crusades against motion pictures and Broadway shows, his occasional statements on controversial issues, and his good works. Over the years, the Cardinal had raised untold millions of dollars for numerous worthy causes and laid enough cornerstones for schools, hospitals, and churches to build a pyramid. At times, he might stop on the street to talk to an elderly woman about her problems, visit the sick wife of a friend, or attend the funeral of a friend's relative. What wasn't obvious was that while very much a part of his office, such activities were often tinged by a political motive. Adept at flattery and developing personal relationships, Spellman traded in favors, which he actively solicited and usually repaid in full. But the Cardinal could be a terrible enemy as well as a wonderful friend. Beneath his soft demeanor, he was tough, calculating, and iron-willed. He guarded his authority jealously and reveled in exercising power. To the 1,100 priests of his archdiocese, Spellman was, quote, the boss, unquote. I remember when I was introduced to President Obama, I was told I was going to meet the boss. A man who ignored most of them, but he was a demanding, formidable, and at times much feared figure. A hard worker, he relentlessly drove the priests who ran a bureaucracy that was virtually a state within itself. The Cardinal was the friend of many influential conservatives, including Clare Boothe Luce, General Douglas MacArthur, and Speaker of the House John McCormack. He was a wonderful person, General Albert Wedemeyer would recall. Spellman's social policies and politics, however, had earned him the bitter enmity of countless liberals. The brilliant journalist I.F. Stone referred to him as a, quote, son of a bitch, unquote. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas was even harsher. Quote, I came to know several Americans who I felt had greatly dishonored our American ideal. One of them was Cardinal Spellman, unquote. The other two on the jurists list, J. Edgar Hoover and John Foster Dulles, were close to the Cardinal. Spellman's Manhattan Chancery was known as the Powerhouse. Though he was Archbishop of New York, his influence within the church knew few boundaries, and he himself was unique in the annals of U.S. history. What made him stand apart was the amazing power he had acquired over the years in international, national, state, and local politics. This might had enabled him to gain concessions for his church that many people once believed impossible. His network encompassed officials of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as many presidents, congressmen, governors, and mayors. His contacts circled the globe and included Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Francisco Franco. Spellman's role was not that of the policymaker priest, but rather he was one of them himself, a pivotal figure in the Byzantine clandestine political and military operations that helped shape the history of his nation and others. Spellman was an ardent nationalist who came to view the aims of his church and those of his country as being the same, a fire-breathing anti-communist. He saw Marxism as the archenemy of both the Vatican and America, and now in 1960 he bitterly resented seeing the ardor of Rome's anti-communism cool, while America still glowed like a hot coal. In time, he would break with the Vatican, because the Pope would vainly seek peace in Vietnam, while the United States pursued the war against communism. The Cardinal himself did all he could to fight what he called the Red Menace. He had wholeheartedly supported the witch hunts of Joe McCarthy, helped the CIA attack leftist movements around the world, and assisted the FBI at home. In his pursuit of power, Spellman helped put his church into the American mainstream, but he also raised new fears and anti-Catholic prejudices. Appearing to head a single-minded political constituency, he used his position to get what he wanted. Politicians accepted Spellman as the political voice of the church and of the nation's 26 million Catholics. But he often applied his immense personal power to pursue his own political aims, even when they opposed those of the Vatican. To both his admirers and his detractors, Spellman was a man of such enormous influence that he was nicknamed the American Pope. As the Cardinal moved through the crowded aisles at the Al Smith dinner, he was treated with great deference by all. For entirely individual reasons, there were guests who saw Spellman only as a kindly, soft-spoken man of God, and others who knew him as a tough man who didn't like to be crossed. The latter group gave Spellman greater homage than warranted by the watered silk robes of his office. Though aging, the Cardinal still made them very wary, knowing the benignly smiling figure was often vindictive. They could never be sure where he would strike. The choice of guest speakers at this dinner demonstrated the Cardinal's political adroitness. Richard M. Nixon and John F. Kennedy, who were battling for the presidency. To date, both had been unwilling to share a dais, but when the Cardinal asked Nixon to appear at the gathering, the vice president accepted at once, knowing he was guaranteed a strong reception from the largely Republican gathering, and could only gain by associating openly with Spellman. Kennedy, though, believed the situation could result in a liability. Striving to minimize his religious affiliation, the Democrat felt he might be harmed if non-Catholic voters thought he was wooing the Cardinal. More importantly, Spellman was working behind the scenes for Nixon. Ironically, most members of the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy were opposed to the senator, even though he was the first member of their faith to run for the presidency since Al Smith 32 years before. They were aware of his notorious womanizing and his nonchalant attitude toward his religion. Such talk was commonplace in the church, nowhere more so than in the New York Archdiocese, where the cardinal habitually traded in scandal and political gossip over his dinner table. Spellman, like his peers, faulted Kennedy less for his weaknesses than for his political positions. The senator had a spotty record on Catholic issues from the beginning of his campaign. Moreover, Kennedy repeatedly stated that the church could expect no concessions from him. For the cardinal, who spent his career blurring the line that was supposed to separate church and state in America, Kennedy's stance was both a betrayal and a challenge. Finally, church officials disliked that Kennedy never went out of his way to curry their favor, as did so many politicians, including some Jews and Protestants as well as Catholics. Indeed, some bishops found their encounters with the senator awkward, as their very presence seemed to embarrass him. For his part, Spellman was far more pragmatic than other bishops. He didn't care if he was disliked as long as the feeling wasn't displayed in public. He deeply resented slights by politicians or anyone else, and he had a long memory, yet he rarely let emotion interfere with his ambitions. His favoring Nixon was simply a matter of backing the candidate who he believed could do him the most good. Well, as you can see, it's a nicely written book. I'm not finishing the prologue because it's about 4 more pages and I want to move on to some more material, but you get the scene, okay? Douglas MacArthur, Henry Luce, Clare Booth Luce, not very far from the American, very right wing with, the Air America crowd that would be profiting so much in the later 60s. And this whole thing, when we talk about Roy Cohn, we talk about all kinds of connections that are based upon blackmail. And is it not very likely that Cardinal Spellman was both a subject and a participant in such activities, and that might be how he got to be so powerful? Might be. I don't know. I'm just speculating, right? So I told you in the title of my show today that it was Cardinal Spellman who caused the Vietnam War. And now I want to give you the text that I based that on. If you'll indulge me a second, I think it's right here. All right, so here James Carroll tells the story from his research and knowledge, personal knowledge of Cardinal Spellman and the men and women around him. I'm now at American Requiem at page 164. It's the story of how, before it was Lyndon Johnson's war, or even Robert McNamara's, the war in Vietnam belonged to my mother's friend, my father's ally, and my brother's enemy, my brother's eminence, and my own designated godfather in the priesthood. The Vietnam War began as Spellman's. I'm on page 164. Among the many cursed moments that led to the American tragedy in Vietnam, none looms more fatefully than the meeting in 1950 between Cardinal Spellman and Ngo Dinh Diem, an obscure Vietnamese Mandarin exiled because of his opposition both to communists, Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh troops had killed one of Diem's brothers, and to the French. Another of his brothers, Ngo Dinh Thuc, was a Roman Catholic bishop, and it was he who introduced Diem to Spellman. Diem was a Catholic mystic who had taken a lifelong vow of celibacy. At the time, he lived in the Maryknoll Seminary in Ossining, New York, just up the Hudson from the city. He had also lived in seminaries in Belgium and, upon first coming to America, in New Jersey. Spellman was immediately taken with Diem. Shortly after they had met, still in 1950, the Cardinal arranged a meeting of the Vietnamese exile and the head of the Asia desk at the State Department in Washington, a young official named Dean Rusk. This is way back in 1950, okay? Catholics in Vietnam were disillusioned with French colonial rule, but they could be counted on as opponents of the communists who had taken the lead in the anti-French Revolution. Thus, though Catholics amounted to less than 10% of the country's population, they seemed a potential base for a, quote, third way, unquote, between colonialism and communism. Such an innovation could be the key to solidifying Western influence throughout the post-colonial world. This humane wish was the beginning of America's interest in Vietnam. Through Spellman, Ngo Dinh Diem seemed a potential guarantor of U.S. influence. Okay. The old Catholic hierarchy in Vietnam was defeated by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. And of course, most of Vietnam is Buddhist or certainly not Catholic, but 10% of it is Catholic up in the north. And as you know, it was Lansdale who organized the horrible boat lift of hundreds of thousands of northern Catholic Vietnamese down to the Saigon area to hopefully shore up the government that they were propping up of Diem. So the whole Catholic angle in the Vietnam War is essential. Hang on a second. It is this theory that just comes out of nowhere that there can be some kind of a third way between overt colonialism and communism. And in seeking that third way, which I don't know why they couldn't come up with the idea of democracy, but that just didn't seem to be in the cards. They came up with a Catholic ruling system, that would be, a kinder, softer aristocracy. I don't know. I guess they were thinking it would be a great way to keep everything under control with the appearance of being nice. But that's just me speculating. I think it's so important that we understand that without this idea that somehow, maybe Dean Rusk thought it up, maybe it was Cardinal Spellman, maybe the two of them were sitting on Roy Cohn's yacht one day and cooked up this idea, and some other people said, hey, yeah, that's a great idea. Anyway, these crazy ideas come from somewhere, and I think we've pinpointed it here with the help of James Carroll, the author. So through Spellman, Diem seemed to be a potential guarantor of U.S. influence. Of course, that's what's really about, isn't it? Is that we want to have our way with the economy and bring in our corporations to do what we do. By the time of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954, Diem was the beneficiary of an elaborate, mainly Catholic network of American support. Spellman had recruited to his cause Joe Kennedy and his son, the senator from Massachusetts, Wild Bill Donovan, the former head of the OSS, and Henry Luce, husband of the most famous Catholic convert in America. Of course, a media baron of incredible power, as he doesn't say. Diem had met with editorial boards at the great newspapers and lectured at prestigious universities, especially Catholic ones, when the U.S. government proposed him as prime minister to the Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai after the French defeat. Diem's support ran from Eisenhower's Washington to Pius XII's Vatican. In June, Diem returned to Vietnam as the head of government. His brother, Tuk, became Archbishop of Saigon. That August, Spellman addressed the American Legion Convention in Washington, and he made the first major American declaration of support for the new regime, saying that its failure would be, quote, taps for the buried hopes of freedom in Southeast Asia, bartering our liberties for lunacies, betraying the sacred trust of our forefathers, becoming serfs and slaves to the red rulers' godless goons, unquote. Okay. You remember Tom Dooley? Probably remember the song, right? Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley, an old folk song revived and pushed into the American consciousness in the early 60s by, what was the Kingston Trio? Anyway, Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley. To me, that whole song and the fact that it was played over and over and over again on the radio is an effort to cover up people who are looking to find out about the Tom Dooley that I'm going to read about right now. Tom Dooley, a Spellman favorite and a Navy doctor operating out of Haiphong, soon began describing the plight of Catholic refugees being driven by the Reds from their homes in the North. A pious Catholic, Dooley was instantly taken as a hero of the Cold War. His best-selling books, which described the torment of Vietnamese Catholics and his broad-based appeal for funds, made Dooley famous. Not incidentally, his reports caused most Americans to believe that Vietnam was a Catholic country under communist siege, an Asian Poland, you might say. Later, Robert McNamara would accept this fiction. He said so at Harvard in 1995. And so would others of the best and the brightest as they stepped onto the slippery slope leading down to an endless lighted tunnel. Dooley, who died in 1961, by the way, of cancer, and I'm very suspicious of that because he was only 31 or 2 years old, who died in 1961 just as John Kennedy ignited the torch of freedom, would be put forward for sainthood by Spellman, but his candidacy would later be swamped in revelations of the secret ties between his efforts and those of the CIA. The post-Dien Bien Phu exodus of terrified Catholics from North Vietnam to the South had in fact been deliberately staged by American intelligence agents, not caused by the vicious rebels, by the vicious Reds, not caused by the vicious Reds. The CIA wanted the hundreds of thousands of Catholics in Haiphong and Hanoi to move because Ngo Dinh Diem needed them as a political base in overwhelmingly Buddhist Saigon. Tom Dooley, whether as a dupe or as a villain, had engineered the first big lie of the United States in Vietnam. Read more about Tom Dooley and his connections. He was also doing epidemiology as well as spying for the CIA, and a very interesting story. And the fact that he died so young of cancer is very suspicious that they needed to shut him up. Unfortunately, whatever the merits of By 1956, Spellman had succeeded in solidifying the commitment to Diem of the liberal establishment. The liberals, right? Robert McNamara, in his memoir, in retrospect, would cite a speech that year by Senator John Kennedy as determinative. Quote, Vietnam represents the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, Kennedy said. It is our offspring. We cannot abandon it. We cannot ignore its needs, unquote. Formerly French Vietnam was by no stretch of the imagination our offspring, but Diem certainly was. Isn't that interesting? We did not cause the disaster in Vietnam following the Second World War and the division of the country, north and south. You know, I mean, the French are the ones that had been the colonial empire, and they didn't do the right thing to set the country free. Of course, we were supporting them, and our support just simply grew into us taking it over. So in that respect, okay. Nevertheless, it wasn't necessary that the United States support the South Vietnamese, government that they stood up, except for the fact that Spellman had gotten all of the Republicans and all of the liberal Democrats, including John Kennedy, to accept the idea that it is America's mission to protect this South Vietnam, this half of a country that is now being taunted as the bastion against godless communism. Spellman's War, or Spelly's War, they call it. Early American support of the Diem regime was channeled through Spellman, with millions of dollars in U.S. aid being disbursed by the Catholic Relief Service. The church was the rock upon which America intended to build its new kind of free world nation. The church was the rock upon which America intended to build its new kind of free world, capitals, nation. Really? Yeah, America was founded with Protestant ideals, not Catholic. And now we've adopted, the Catholic Church as the rock. I mean, the rock. Unfortunately, whatever the merits of America's romantic search for a third way between communism and colonialism, the concrete form of it took was an embrace of a dangerous illusion. Instead of leading a democratic government, Diem ruled through his malevolent family. His brothers took Ngo Dinh Can and Ngo Dinh Nu, of course, Madame Nu's brother, Madame Nu's husband, the conspiratorial head of the secret police, and his wife, the nefarious Madame Nu. Lyndon Johnson would call Diem the Winston Churchill of Asia, but he was more like its Papa Doc Duvalier, only far more heavily armed and funded by his U.S. patrons. While the American government credited Diem with cracking down on communists and jailing dissidents, he was mainly waging an ever more vicious war against the Buddhists. He had the Catholic faith of the Inquisition, and he sought to impose it especially on rural peasants who, unlike city dwellers, were not beneficiaries of lavish American aid. Diem was the Viet Minh's dream, driving more and more of the population into its arms. Americans expected him to be a Democrat, but he was a true medieval Catholic, of the kind that even the Vatican knew only in nostalgia. Diem believed that he ruled by the will of God. McNamara cites the U.S. support of Diem as the critical first mistake. quote, that he had studied at the Catholic seminary in New Jersey in the early 1950s seemed evidence that he shared Western values. As we got closer and closer to the situation, however, we came to learn otherwise. We totally misjudged that, unquote. Robert McNamara. Buddhists staged a huge demonstration on May 8, 1963 in Saigon to protest Archbishop Tuk's edict banning Buddhist flags on Buddha's birthday. 9 people were killed when the Catholic-led army fired at the protesters. The unrest only mounted, culminating in early June when Thich Quang Duc, a Buddhist monk, set himself on fire on a Saigon street. Douglas Pike wrote that he could see the whole fabric of Vietnamese society coming apart. Around the world, and even in Washington, the immolated monk, Madame Nu's infamous barbecued bonds, was seen as a true sacrament of Diem's failure. A few months later, in what McNamara would call the fateful fall of 1963, Diem and his brother Nu, abandoned even by Spellman, were killed in a coup the Kennedy administration tacitly approved of, if it did not outright engineer it. Cardinal Spellman, meanwhile, had not allowed himself a second thought. As the war had become Americanized, he became even more devoted to it. He became Curtis LeMay in a red soutane. He traveled to Vietnam frequently, early to dedicate it, a Marian basilica he had funded, later armed with, quote, holy smokes, unquote. This is a package of cigarettes with his picture in it called Holy Smokes, to spend Christmas with grateful GIs. It was during a Christmas visit to Vietnam that he made his famous statement of faith, quote, my country, right or wrong, unquote. The grunts who cheered him for his unthinking loyalty to the mystery of what he had put them there had no more way of knowing that than I did, as I looked forward to his ordaining me. That central to that mystery was Spellman himself. If some Catholics went on to act as if they bore special responsibility for ending the war, perhaps it was because they did. This, of course, James Carroll's memoir of his father and his own I can't think of the proper word, his own memoir, I suppose, of how he developed his anti-war feelings and participation in the anti-war movement with Philip Berrigan and others. The classic case of the son rebelling against the father because the son does not understand or accept the father's values, the product of the church itself having the centuries of belief behind it, in which Father Joe Carroll is completely entranced and will never see beyond it. His son sees beyond it, and he sees hope in other aspects of the church, such as John the 23rd, who follows after Pius XII and becomes one of the more liberal voices that he can find hope in. Of course, when Pope John the 23rd dies in 1963, he's followed up by Montini, Paul VI, the man who we just read about, but the man who I have identified as a participant in the operations of Alan Dulles in the Operation Sunrise, and an organizer and a fervent supporter of the rat lines, the ability of all of the Nazis to escape, the money to escape, the crimes to go unpunished, the genocides to remain mysteriously covered up, and the responsibility for World War II never fully explored because the church, of course, was acting on its own behalf, just as Cardinal Spellman, as we read in the book, always acted essentially on his own behalf. The church was nearly killed off in the 19th century. This, I think, is a point that I would promote, looking at it like this: that when the Italian Revolution took over the city of Rome, the Catholic Church realized that it was going to die if it didn't have allies. And it made an ally, and that ally was the British aristocracy, the British, uh, the British just generally, because of the dominance of Great Britain in Europe that had gradually taken over places like, France, and then generating behind the scenes the wars of the 20th century. The Catholic Church has been working to help Britain achieve its aims. And I think ultimately it was British aims in Southeast Asia that were at stake, and not American. Whereas the church comes in and, knowingly or not, is there to help the British ideas of subversion and taking over and destroying the existing societies that are there for thousands of years. My real interest here is in James Carroll's father, Joseph F. Carroll, who was the head of the DIA at the time that President Kennedy was killed, and who the Torbert memo says was, along with Louis Bloomfield of the FBI's Division 5, supervising the Defense Industrial Security Commission or Committee, the DISC or DISCO, which Torbert says organized and carried out the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So the big question that I leave open at the end of this show is, to what extent is it likely that the Catholic Church, through somebody like Francis Spellman, gave the okay or even participated in the organization of the assassination of President Kennedy, for the very reasons that, in the Catholic sense, if it was Spellman, then it was the failure to pursue the Vietnam War through to a victory. The hell with the unintended consequences, bomb away, bomb them back into the Stone Age, which was what General LeMay advised. These very conservative Catholics and the very conservative Pentagon officers were doing the will of the Dulles and Wall Street money, whether they knew it or not. And all of that deceit, all of that manipulation, psychological manipulation of the public, and the existing belief system of the infallibility of the Pope. These things all came together to create the tragedy of the Vietnam War and our losses of young men and women, our losses of our national pride, our national unity, are all the results of that horrible, horrible decision that somehow was made back in the early 1950s, that it was America's mission to support the South Vietnamese against the Viet Minh, who were clearly in control of the country and about to take the whole shebang. It's really is for me. It's understanding what happened to my father, by understanding what happened to President Kennedy, by understanding the powers in play, and this American Pope, this Francis Cardinal Spellman, who was connected with everybody, including the most notorious people like Roy Cohn, and that connects directly to all the mafia organizations. This cabal of wealthy people spoke through Francis Cardinal Spellman, and they gave us the Vietnam War. That is the big story of our lifetime. So hopefully, by understanding all of the aspects, the different facets of the situation, we can resolve ourselves to an understanding, a common understanding of how America was misled into that war, and to be alert and aware of the change that happened when Pope Pius XII said, it's okay, you can bomb people back into the Stone Age, and all of those people that die are just unintended consequences, and that's okay with me, because I am the Pope, and I am the supreme judge of morality on earth. We can't have deference to popes like that. As I say, he was speaking on behalf of trying to preserve the existence of the church, which required, preserving the aristocracy in Italy and the Habsburgs and all of the great powers of the aristocracy and nobility of France and Germany, dating back centuries. He is a reactionary. He's got to fight against any type of popular movements, and that empowers people like J. Edgar Hoover to conduct the COINTELPRO, and empowers Francis Spellman to induce us, our whole nation, into a disastrous war. All right. Thanks for being with me. Have a great afternoon. I will see you tomorrow with Hrvoje Morić, who's been very busy doing a lot of interviews, and I look forward to catching up with his work as we do once a month. See you tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, with Hrvoje Morić of Geopolitics and Empire.